today. We are having our last career clinic of the semester of spring 2023. So there's a big celebration for that, but no worries. We are planning a full schedule for fall 2023. So as soon as you get back, we will have plenty of more topics on their way. But today we are getting focused on interview skills. I know that there are still a lot of you, maybe you're still looking for that internship for the summer, or you've already landed, wherever you are in your process, whether this is going to be super helpful in the short term or the long term. Interview skills are something that are so incredibly important to have. And we're just really excited to share some tips and tricks with you today. I think doing a quick reality check on this clinic is very important, though. Just remember that while we do have a lot to offer in these slides, what we're going to be pushing more than anything is that you do put this into practice. And how we want you to do that is actually scheduling an appointment with your career consultant and doing a mock interview. That is the most important and valuable thing that you can do, because our goal is to help you present yourselves with confidence in whatever interview format that you have coming up in the now or in the future. And so we just want to be able to position you to do that well. And I think the only way to truly do that is to get some practice in. So just remember that. And I'll make sure to put the slide up at the end where you know how to schedule those appointments with us. But moving right along, I would love to introduce myself and the rest of my incredible team. So we are the Center for Career and Professional Development. My name is Stacy Patola, and I am the career consultant who primarily serves our math, engineering, and technology populations. And we actually have two other teammates on the line today, and I'm going to let them real quick introduce themselves.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ashley Herman. I am the career consultant specifically for the business school, and I serve right now both the Atlanta and the Macon campus, but I'm physically located here on the Macon campus.
Hi, everybody. I'm Julie Cannon, and I'm the career consultant that's on the Atlanta campus. And I serve all Mercer students, but particularly folks on the Atlanta campus and the Henry and Douglas Regional Academic Centers.
Thank you so much, Ashley and Julie. So excited to have you guys today. Ashley, thank you so much for being here to present with me on this incredible topic. And Ashley is actually going to start us off on our first slide of content. So Ashley, take it away whenever you're ready.
I'd like to add what Stacey was talking about earlier about the value of having a one-on-one appointment. I think it's really important to note before we start any of these clinics that career is very personal, meaning that a lot of the advice that we can give for in a workshop base is going to be very overgeneralized. But at the end of the day, many of the answers to her questions are going to be, well, it depends. Well, it depends on you, your experiences. Well, it depends on what you're applying for. So just go into this knowing that this, a lot of the advice that we're giving is we're giving it in a one size fits all manner, but it's not. So if you have specific situations that are unique to you or your background, know that that's what we're here for, one-off conversations and those one-on-one meetings. But this context is incredibly important. So that way those one-on-one meetings can be more valuable and productive. And just so it's important going into into our conversations about interviews, knowing that there are many different types and formats of interviews. I think it's really important, not that we go over every single one of these, but that we are just realistic in knowing that basically any point in the process where you are applying for a role, consider it part of the interview. A lot of times we get over comfortable in different parts of the situation. Maybe we run into a colleague who works at that company at a coffee shop. You need to be behaving in a manner that everything that you say can and will be held against you kindly. But just know any of these different formats, whether it be face-to-face, a group panel, so you're in a group of many of your different colleagues that are going to be your peers, or maybe you're in a group setting where you and several other candidates are in an interview together. Maybe it's a technical interview, so maybe you are being given specific questions related to your industry or field that you're having to provide technical answers to those questions. Sometimes these can include case studies, sometimes these can include many different ways. So depending on the industry that you're going to, the types of interviews that you're going to run into are very industry specific. So I would encourage you, talk to members of individuals in those fields, do informational interviews, informal interviews with individuals in the field, and ask them what type of interviews are common in this field or going into this industry. But these are some examples. Leadership would be talking about, and most often that's like the final round of interviews where you're talking with a member of leadership. And then career fair, just walking up to someone in a career fair expo, that introducing yourself, that is part of the interview process. And then on the spot, just randomly running into someone. So again, we won't exhaust all those, but it's important to note whether you're calling someone to verify the time of your interview. So it's a phone conversation and it's a phone interview or virtual interview. I will say that post-COVID, virtual interviews have become far more common, especially virtual pre-screens. So what we saw is a massive shift of companies using phone as the most common pre-screen format to virtual. So there are online platforms where it's asynchronous. They give you questions and you respond and you submit your answers, and you never see or know who's reviewing your interviews. So depending on their format is going to have a big impact on how and what you're going to answer and what you're going to say. We're going to talk a little bit more about the most common hangups in each of these formats toward the end of this conversation.
So next, before your interview, there are a lot of things you should consider. I think some of the things that I'm about to say will really help you, especially when you've got an interview scheduled. The nerves start to build a little bit and you start to wonder, well, what exactly is going to take place in the interview? Am I really ready for this? You're thinking very futuristically in the moment, and you just need something to ground you and bring you back into the present of what's going to take place for the interview. And so something that we always recommend is you should really consider the following and truly reflect on this before you go in to an interview situation. And that's one, can you do the job? So thinking over your skills and experiences, sometimes I think there's a lot of imposter syndrome that takes place when headed into an interview, thinking that, well, did I just luck into this interview? Am I really qualified to be in the room, on the Zoom, whatever the format may be? And so I think going back to that job position description can really remind you, yes, I'm absolutely qualified to be here. I have all of the essential skills and experiences. All I need to do is elaborate on them a little bit more and really build the bridge for this employer. So reminding yourself that you can actually do the job that's being asked of you is so important when going into the interview, because that way, whatever experiences you can recall, you're able to do so through the lens of this experience has prepared me to do this job and to do it well. Number two is, will you do the job? What's your work ethic, motivation, and energy about the job that you're interviewing for? Are you excited to be in the room interviewing for this position, or, really reflecting on, well, am I that excited, or am I too nervous to be excited right now? You really do need to come back to knowing your why. And I think that's why we talk about, especially from a career consultant standpoint, when we're meeting with our students is, while you may be qualified to throw your hat in a lot of rings, it's really important not to just throw your hat in every ring you're qualified for. You want to do that for positions that you are passionate about, because someone's going to be able to see that displayed in an interview, and someone's also going to notice when it's not being displayed. And so it's so important to go back to, well, I don't want to waste my time and I don't want to waste anyone else's. And so is this a job that I want to do? Am I excited and motivated to do the work here? Do my values align with what this organization believes in? And then there's number three, will you fit in? Or essentially, will this organization fit into your life? The culture, just the overall fit and dynamics of how everything is structured at that place of employment. And it's always a two-way street. Just like I said, are you going to fit in with them? Are they going to fit into what your idea of this job was? When you think of, that quote unquote dream job, was this sort of what you envisioned? And really going back and marinating on a lot of the things that beforehand, because there's a lot to be gleaned going into an interview, but there's also that recognition that there's a lot you won't find out until you go through the interview process. And so give yourself that chance to go through and really have that experience of learning what there is to be offered on both sides.
And going along and tagging on and flipping that on its head, talking about two-way street, these are the three things that you should be considering while going into an interview, but also know that these are the three top things that employers are trying to find out about you as well. So can you do the job? Do you have the skills to do it? Will you do the job? Do you have the work ethic? And then will you fit in? I will say that I've talked to many interviewers, and many of them will say that Oftentimes we overthink and overfixate on answering number one, but in the interview, we don't really focus on displaying to an interviewer's number two and number three. A lot of employers will say, I can teach you the skills. I can teach you the job. I can't teach you to want to show up and work with me, and I can't teach you to be a part of my team. So do not undervalue number two and number three. It would be my piece of advice to you.
Right.
I would say that the number one important part of preparing for an interview is the research. It's really hard to sell yourself on something or sell anything to anyone if you don't know what that is or why you're selling it. So I think being self-aware is incredibly important. And not only being self-aware, but also being aware of what you're applying to. So what services does the employer provide? Who are their target audience? Do they have any competitors? What are they successful at? What do they like to boast on? What are some hot topics in their industry? If you're in a specific industry, are there hot topics either in the news or in public policy or in that field that you know are going to be on that industry's mind? Be ready, read articles, do your research in those areas. Be ready to come to the room and to the table with talking points in those areas to again, show them that you fit at that table and are part of that conversation. And then also, are you really the best candidate? You have to, number one, convince yourself of this first before you convince anyone else. So look at the job description, look at your skills and find where they overlap. Find those experiences that you have shared in common with what you want them to know. Write down those non-negotiables. So in this interview, I need them to know I have this experience. I need them to know that I'm passionate about this. I need them to know that I have this skill. And then that's what you're going to focus your answers on, drawing back. So by preparing in advance to identify why it is, in fact, you are a good candidate for the role, and coming up with those example target or brand stories to be able to display those skills, and having those in the back pocket will make it easier to answer any of the questions, even the left fly balls that come your way, because you have these answers that you can easily apply and adapt. So again, reflect on your experiences and have them in your back pocket. Do that groundwork prior to. And a huge part of that research when you're researching the company is not only researching the company, but take a moment and research yourself, because they're doing it to you. You better bet the very first thing they're doing is they're doing a Google search on you, just like the very first thing you did is Google search them. So check your professional image online. What does your LinkedIn look like? Is it a picture from when you were 18 and now you're not? Or is it a picture of someone's face half cropped off? Or so look at the professional image, look at the background. I would say even go as far as listening to your voicemail to see if it's set up. These little details do matter. And it's important that you look at that. And just know that because they can be looking into you, it's completely appropriate. If you know that next Tuesday, you're going to be interviewing with the associate director of such and such, look on the company's website. Who is the associate director of such and such? Do they have a LinkedIn? Do your own research. Mm-hmm. That's completely appropriate.
No, absolutely. Okay, so next part after the research is actually setting the stage for showing up to your interview. And so a lot of people think that they really have to do a lot of this prep for in-person interviews. That is absolutely false. There takes just as much preparation for any of the pre-recorded Zoom phone interviews, because those are all different formats that you have to keep different pieces, different components in mind. For instance, you need to prepare your outfit no matter what the format is. If it's a Zoom, if you're wanting to do, party up top, professional blouse and things, and then gym shorts on the bottom, you do you sort of thing. But especially if you're showing up in person, everything's going to be a little bit different. These are all things that need to happen in advance. This is never something that needs to happen the morning of. So please make sure you're preparing all these things in advance. You don't need to be walking out the door, having to turn back, wasting time, realizing like, oh, I forgot my notebook, I forgot my resume, I forgot those copies of things, forgot my list of questions, and I only wrote them down. I didn't save them on a flash drive or anything like that. Any of those items you really just need to have on you at all times. And so prepping your outfit, thinking about what you're going to bring. A lot of students who've come into our offices before think that they're really not allowed to bring anything, whether that's copies of their updated documents, maybe if they've changed since they've applied and you just wanted to bring them in and say, hey, I just wanted you all to know I have updated a few things since I've come for this interview, and I just wanted you to be aware and have my most updated current version of my documents. Two, some students don't think they're allowed to take notes during interviews. You absolutely have the autonomy to take notes about what you are learning, because some of those things you're only going to learn during the interview process. That's sort of the really special part of an interview, is you're getting to learn things that a lot of other people wouldn't know about the company because you've been invited exclusively to this part of the process. And so that shows initiative, that shows that you care, is taking notes and actually caring about what you're learning in the room or on the Zoom, whatever it may be. So feel free to bring a notepad and a pen. Feel free to take notes on the side. Also, feel free to be transparent about that. If you're on a Zoom, a live Zoom interview, and say, hey, I don't want anyone to think I'm being distracted on my phone or a device over to the side. I am actually just taking notes about what I'm learning here today. So I just want everyone to be aware. You know, call out what you may feel might be an elephant in the room. Feel free to bring a bottle of water. A lot of times for in-person interviews, you may be provided that, but especially if it's on Zoom, take a moment. Sometimes that's even a strategy. If you need just one little extra second to think, you just say, excuse me for one moment, pick up your bottle or your cup of water and take a quick sip and really ground yourself into that question, and don't just immediately, you know, for lack of better words, word vomit whatever came up as soon as they asked the question. Last things, but definitely not least, especially if it's in person, where is the interview and when should you show up? Never leave your home with just enough time to get there. Always plan as though it's going to take twice or even triple as long to get there according to traffic. If it's on Teams, if it's on Zoom, have a friend practice call you. Make sure all of your devices are set up that you can actually connect. Be aware that if you're doing it in whatever space you're on for a virtual one, keep in mind of your background. Don't have flashy lights on the walls going on. Don't swivel in your chair during the interview. There are a lot of different things to keep in mind when it's virtual. If you have construction going on near your house or your apartment, if you're close to a railroad, those are all different things that no one thinks about until it's time and they're like, oh dear, all this is happening in the background and they probably have no clue. They can't hear me. Make sure all of those things are in play. There are so many different things to think about. So I think doing a practice call or just a practice anything is the best way to make sure everything is ironed out and smooth and you just feel confident the morning of. There have been several students that I have planned morning of practice Teams or Zoom calls with them to make sure that their connection is good, their audio sounds okay, and that their background and their outfit is appropriate for the day. We are more than happy to do that as an office. So always feel free to ask if you don't have a friend to phone to do those. Remember, we serve alumni for life. So no matter where you are in your interview process, 5-10 years from now, give us a call and say, hey, will you do a quick test mock interview with me and make sure everything seems good to go, because I'm so excited about this opportunity. Ashley, you have anything to add to that one?
Just that there are 5 million things in the interview and job search process that you cannot control. You cannot control if a train is going to come by your house at that time. But the things that you can control, even if it is 5, the things that you can control will put you in a position of strength to where you will have this confidence when you go into an interview and be less easily shaken when you're in there. So let go of the things that you can't control and feel comfortable in the things that you have already taken control over is my advice to that.
Mm-hmm.
So showtime. So little things, part of being prepared, you know, my very first interview right after my big girl interview right after college was downtown Atlanta. I've driven through Atlanta many times for events and things like that, but I had to be put into consideration. Yes, I drove downtown to see where my interview was going to be on a Sunday, but my traffic on Sunday was not going to be the same as Monday. And so I had to prepare in advance. Also, where am I parking? Unfortunately, I had planned in advance. I knew where I was supposed to park. I paid in advance, but the interview went longer than I anticipated. And I came out to a boot on my car. So these little things, again, I could not have controlled that. But the things that I could, I prepared in advance. Come prepared, show time, and come again by doing little things. So if you know that the interview is completely on the phone and you're not going to be face to face and they're not going to see you, if putting on your power blazer is going to make you feel and sound more confident, then put on your power blazer. It does not matter that they cannot see you. So again, these little things of putting yourself in the right mindset, do not undervalue that. Listen to your jam out playlist on your way to the interview. Have a friend or someone that you really look up to give you a 5-minute pep talk. If you want a pep talk, come to me. I will pep talk you up before your interview. But go in, and I would say also eliminate the distractions. Turn off mobile devices. If you know that your watch is going to be buzzing at you and you're going to be looking at it, leave this in the car. Listen carefully, take notes, but be 100% present in that moment. Employers can tell. And again, don't underuse the opportunity to observe observe the culture going on around you. Stacey said it best. If you get to the point where you're especially in person interview, you have been invited to come behind the scenes, and they're showing you behind the veil of the inner workings of that company and their culture. Don't misuse that opportunity. Pay attention. Who's talking to each other? How are they interacting? Are they interacting with each other in a different way behind closed doors? So off stage versus on stage. Pay attention to these little things. And then just, again, having confidence, but you have to sell yourself on the role and your fit and belonging in that room before you can do that. It makes it much harder to fake it.
Okay, so actually getting into the interview questions. So we're finally here. We've done all this talk and we're finally inside the room. We're on the Zoom and we're about to go into their questions that they have for us. So just know that a piece of that could be not just, asking you theoretical questions, how might you handle this? They may start asking you some concrete questions, and you really do have to have some scenarios in mind. And so that is what we refer to as behavioral interviewing, because the most accurate predictor of future performance is what you've done in the past. So they're trying to figure out how you've handled situations specifically in the past. And so it's an attempt to sort of gauge how you will in the future, specifically at their company, what kind of investment they're making in you. So the biggest piece of advice for these is don't rush into these, really think through your scenarios. And that's why that preparation is so key. You may not be able to predict the exact question list that they'll have for you. But when you look at a company and you do the appropriate research on them, you're going to be able to glean what they care about and what they are trying to learn about you in an interview. And that can help you gauge what type of scenarios from your past are going to be really helpful to remember. If you've noticed on the position description that they are harping a lot on teamwork, what kind of team member you're going to be, and what specific type of person they're looking for, one, reflect on what kind of teammate you are, who you are in a group work setting, and really start to think about some of your past group projects and whatever classes or things that you've worked on during your time at Mercer, and see which scenarios will allow them to learn what you hope they learn about you in the interview. And so having those scenarios in mind is so important, because we all know that just because someone asks a question, the first scenario that we think of is not always the best scenario. I would say in my mock interviews that I do, I call it clearing the pipes. When I ask a question and your first sort of gut response is, a specific scenario. And then as you're going through it, you're starting to realize, wow, I don't know why I thought of this or why my mind equated these two to relate, because this really has nothing to do with what the question asked. I'm just stating the scenario that I immediately thought of, but it in no way answers what they're asking me. And so you really have to take a moment, clear the pipes, and modify and find the best scenario. And so it's all about asking, like, do my skills align with the type of employee that they're looking for? And by telling them about this situation or how I handled something in the past, what is it that they're learning about me from what I'm saying? Because you want to position yourself well. So there is a balance in that transparency and getting them to learn what you want them to learn about you. Obviously, we don't want to fabricate any stories. I know that can seem very tempting in the moment on something maybe you saw on a TV show the night before or something that your friend went through. But fabrication is just not the way to go in these interviews. It's no way to sell yourself, and it's usually going to get you caught out later. So try, do your best to be thinking ahead, because authenticity is the key in this, because they want to hear about you. They want to hear about your experiences, and you do have them. And that's why, especially in behavioral interviewing, some of my students tell me sometimes on a really tough question, they're like, truthfully, Stacey, I have not experienced this yet. And so that right there is an expectation. That employer asked you that question not by saying like, oh, you had to have gone through this already, but it's asking you, have you gone through this, and can you tell me how you handled it? If there is a question that you truly have not encountered yet in your time at Mercer, understand that that's okay. Ask yourself for a moment, okay, is there a reason that I haven't gone through it? Is it because I haven't taken this class yet because I'm doing this interview for this internship? Or is it because, oh, I didn't have that specific opportunity that might lend me to experience that type of scenario? And so that's when we go into the value of transparency and saying like, okay, well, at this point in time, I haven't experienced that as a concrete scenario in my own life, but I would still love to take the initiative and tell you how I believe I would handle that situation. That's where you take a concrete question, you turn it into something theoretical, because rather than just saying, oh, I'm sorry, I haven't gone through that yet, and having nothing else to give them, it's you taking initiative and telling them what you believe that you would do. And so it's still giving them something to learn about you and about your style, about how you construct problems and how you handle things. And so I hope that makes sense for everyone. And that's definitely something we practice a lot in mock interviews here. Ashley, do you have anything else to add to that?
I would say, given your scenario that you mentioned where you don't have the exact experience that they're asking about. So an example I use, if you're asked, give me an example of a time where you disagreed with a supervisor. If you've never been in a working situation before and you've not had that experience, but you have maybe disagreed with a professor, it's completely okay to utilize that parallel and say, I haven't had that experience before, but there has been an example of when I disagreed with a professor, and this is how I handled it. What they're asking about, and this goes back to in behavioral interview questions, the question that they're asking is there's always an underlying reason why. So for example, using my example, give me an example of a time where you disagreed with a supervisor. I don't really care about the supervisor. I don't even really care about that specific time. I'm asking you that question because I'm wondering how you are going to handle conflict. How are you going to handle feedback? How are you going to handle it when you disagree with me as your supervisor in the future? And so using that parallel is completely appropriate to answer that question. Just dodging the question and talking about something completely different, or even worse, focusing on the supervisor and how they disagreed with you and what they did wrong, that is the only way that answer could be inappropriate.
I think that's really important, translating your experiences into what they're actually asking. So that was a really great point from Ashley. And
you can only do that if you stop to think.
Right.
And it's completely appropriate. It is much better if you have to weigh. It is much better to take a moment, pause, and give me a thoughtful response that answers my whole question than to immediately just spit out the first thing that comes to mind. There are no bonus points. This is not Jeopardy. There's no bonus points for answering in speed. The only answering correctly and fully is how you're going to get those bonus points.
And so in answering these questions, there is sort of a trick of the trade that everyone has probably heard up to this point, and it's called the STAR method. And so we talk about answering questions like a rock star. If you feel confident enough to use this method, it's sort of just one of those things that grounds you back to the steps of answering a behavioral interview question. You know, you're addressing the situation that they're asking about. You're taking the task that was required of you, or the key scenario or situation, the action that you took, and then the result that came about from it. Because again, just like Ashley said, they don't care about a lot of the components that are included in the question. They care about how you handled something. So if we had to say R is definitely the most important part, and it cannot be forgotten, because answering these questions are like writing an essay or telling a story. There is a beginning, there is a middle, and there should always be an end. And that end should always bring it back around to the point, no matter how far you've strayed. T is for task, but it may sometimes be for a tangent, and you never want to go off on one of those for too long. So please always bring it back around to the result of what they've actually asked from you. It's trying to wade through, the disguise that sometimes can be like surrounding the question, and get to the nitty gritty of like, what was the result from this? And again, what do I want them to learn about me based on what I did in this scenario? And so the result is truly key, because that's putting the end on your story. And that's the only way they're actually going to take away, to have a takeaway in general, to learn anything from your answer, by using the STAR method. Some students don't like to use this method. And so rather than, really breaking it down into situation, task, action, result, I recommend just writing down an outline for your answer for these types of questions. And so when we present different types of questions to you, it's really making sure you're addressing each part of the prompt of the question and making sure you provide that outline. So again, we're not trying to script ourselves. Scripting is not a good idea when going into your interviews. I know it can be really tempting because you've got this stellar answer that you wrote out, and it's fine to write out an answer to sort of, again, recall a situation that maybe happened a long time ago, but it has value for this answer. But we should never go into script, because even though the content forwards and backwards, I promise you, if you deviate from even one word of your script, you're going to lose it, and it's going to seem like you don't know what you actually do. And that can be really devastating, especially when you walk out and you're like, I knew what I wanted to say. It was only because I wrote a script down that I messed up at all. And so that's why sort of doing an outline, which is what STAR is trying to prompt you to do, but really just giving an outline in general of like, okay, I need to address this portion, and make sure I tie it off with a bow.
So I will say that behavioral interviewing in STAR is not something that Stacey and I are coming up with. This is very well known. There are many large companies that in the interview process, as part of the request or invitation to the interview, they will actually give you some preparatory, some either web page or documents kind of getting you set up for the interview. And many times they refer to STAR and behavioral interviewing. So this is an expectation. I would say that using STAR allows you and helps you to be organized and answer that question completely. Just because of the way that we oftentimes stick and do a really great job at explaining the situation and the task. But at that point, we lose focus of the action and result. And so I would elaborate to say it's not as important what color lampshade there was in the room, but what general room you were when it happened. Does that make sense? So don't get in the nitty-gritty details. We don't need to know, it's a dark winter's night where it was snowing and, I walked 2 ways uphill. I was a sophomore at Mercer University when this happened. So very situation task should be very high level. And then when you get to the action and result is when you get to the roots of it. And I would also elaborate with when you get to the result, don't just say, tell me about a time where you had multiple deadlines. Well, as a sophomore at Mercer University, I had X, Y, Z. Don't start rehashing everything on your resume. Just stay again, very high level. The action, I did these things and use these skills to use my time management. And then result, don't just say, and then end it there. What's the result? I passed. Okay, but did you get A's? Even better yet, did you receive president's list that semester? So go to the, I would say, big picture result, not only just talking about that time where you disagreed with the supervisor, but now after that disagreement, I have a better relationship with that supervisor. And as a result of that, I've actually been asked to lead in the future. So when you think result, think big picture result. That's oftentimes an opportunity for you to really sell yourself as well and to sell it as an accomplishment. And here's the big one. If asked a question that is seemingly negative, so tell me about a time where you failed, or have you ever disagreed with a supervisor? Those are all behavioral questions. If you spend so much time on the situation and task, it can paint you in a pretty negative way. So you have to focus your result on that big picture. What did you learn as a result of that failure? What was that big? Again, that's how you tie it with a pretty bow, like Miss Stacy mentioned, to make it a more positive answer. I love doing this sample in class because a lot of times students do a really, really great job. And I go, great, you just explained very well how you failed at life. And they leave it there. So I say, challenge yourself, make sure that you're doing that big picture R and selling what you've learned from that situation.
Okay, so when you're answering questions, there can be a lot of hangups or things that, again, we recommend trying to really reflect on and notice, be very self-aware when you're answering interview questions. And so these are sort of some of the common hangups when you're answering, or just in your answers in general for employers' questions. Just answering the question. Ashley, you said it best on this one. Will you explain this bullet point for them really quick?
So this is the concept of, if you're given the opportunity to talk about, okay, tell me about a time where you disagreed with a supervisor, you just answer that question and you don't take advantage opportunities to sell other things. So your communication skills, your time management skills, other different skills in answering the question. So just answering the question is 1 point shot. The 3-point shot or home run is answering the question completely and pulling in other skills and experiences and competencies into that answer.
Yes. Next would definitely be doing something that's too long. Sometimes it can be really hard to tell. This goes back to your formatting. When you have in person and you can see people nodding their heads, really smiling, enjoying your answer, you can kind of gauge how much longer you need to continue talking or whether you fully fleshed out what you wanted to say. But be very mindful of answers that are taking way too long to get to that R, to get to the result and tying off the bow. There is definitely, we want you to set the stage because it definitely goes into not being long enough. We certainly don't want you to just answer yes or no to the question, which we have later on this list. We want you to fully answer their question, but just keep in mind how long it's actually taking you to do that. And if you've actually maintained that level of engagement that you wanted in that answer, whether it's on the phone where you can't see people's responses to your answers, what their expressions are, whether they're kind of thinking at that point you're sort of droning on, or on team Zooms, or especially in person, you can actually kind of see, but don't rely on that fully. Actually look at your answer and say, well, I think some of this sounds a little redundant. I could probably take this out of my answer. Or like Miss Ashley was saying just a few minutes ago, I really didn't need to get that granular on that detail because that wasn't really the big picture. That was kind of in writing an essay. I added a little too much fluff to it. That just wasn't necessary. Having an answer be way too canned, which I think goes back to you scripting yourself. Everyone is going to be able to tell when you script yourself because you tend to sound robotic. It's not authentic. It's not genuine. It's not in real time because you wrote it a long time ago and now you're just writing it out and trying to make sure that you don't miss a word. Please be mindful of your tone. If your tone's very flat and uneven, people are going to be able to tell, and it's going to sometimes signify that you're not as passionate about answering the questions or that you don't want to be there. And that's the last thing you want anyone thinking, especially if it's not true. If it's true, we've got to go all the way back to the beginning of like, why are we here? What was our why for this process? But if you are there and you are excited, you have to do everything in your power to make sure they know it. And having a really recorded robotic answer is just not going to indicate that to them as a candidate. Not diversifying your answer and really just sticking to the same types of answers every single time or pulling from the same scenario. if you had an incredible internship and you find that a lot of your answers are drawing back on that internship, while it is wonderful that you learned so much and you're able to pull so many different types of experiences from there, it should in no way be the only thing you can draw upon. Now, I know that some students may come back and say, well, like that really was like my main experience on my resume. That's true, but this is also a skill in you being able to find value in your other experiences, because just because maybe you didn't identify value in it doesn't mean that there isn't value there. So again, I think that's when it takes getting a second opinion from your career consultant, from your professor, from other people to actually recognize that, hey, you actually did have both hard and soft skills that you took away from this experience. You're just undervaluing it. And if you do, the employer is going to, because that's going to be the only lens through which they hear it, is going to be your tone of like, oh, well, that didn't matter a lot. I want to talk about just this internship. So we really have to make sure we diversify our types of answers that we're giving, and we're not only relying on one experience that had honed all of our skills up to this point in life. We already talked about yes and no answers. That also aids to asking questions at the end. You know, they don't want to hear just answers that they can provide yes or no with at the end when you're asking questions about the company. So pay attention to that as well. We'll talk about that a little bit later. And then giving just too much too soon. This can mean a lot of different things, however you want to interpret it. But one really big one is, you know, we know that there are going to be multiple questions throughout the interview. So make sure you're not saying everything about yourself. And that goes back into it being way too long-winded of an answer. I find that this happens most often on the very first question that you're usually asked, which is tell me a little bit about yourself. You end up giving everything that they're going to end up asking you later. And so that's kind of going back to your level of restraint and that patience of, hey, I need to highlight what needs to be highlighted for this question because I know they're going to ask me this later. So there is such a thing as touching on things, but not getting too nitty gritty into the situations until later when you know you're going to be asked about them at that time.
I'll add to the diversifying your answers as well. Think about it. So again, it's not just about your skills or experiences, it's about that relationship building. So maybe don't pull all of your experiences from your work experience. It's completely valid and worthwhile pulling from your personal experiences, such as maybe volunteer experiences that you've done, or work that wasn't as relevant, but you've learned a lot from, or maybe you're a student athlete. Bringing up those things about you, the interviewer can have similar situations and background in, and it can help build that rapport if you have that shared experience. So, you know, don't be afraid to bring up, you know, in high school, I played XYZ ball, or, you know, in college, I competed, but actually wasn't selected for the team, because that's a shared experience. And it shows, it shows a little bit of you being, exposing yourself and showing that, and they can relate to that. So that's another really great reason why diversifying your answers is definitely within your benefit as well. So when we talk about virtual, so these are just a few that I see. Camera angle, this is very, very important, especially when we talk about dressing professionally. If your camera angle is so close that it's up this one, I can count how many nose hairs are in my nose. But two, I really can't see what I'm wearing or if it's professional. You don't know if I'm wearing, you know, a bathing suit or if I'm wearing a professional top. So providing space between the camera and having your camera angle up can certainly help with perceived confidence, as well as not leave room for any interpretation as to what I'm wearing and whether or not it's professional. Also, it gives you some space, and it allows, it removes opportunity for, if I'm very, very close, every move I make is going to look like a nervous shift. So camera angle is very important. Rule of thumb is up and back. Background, is it neutral? Is it distracting? Pay attention. I've seen crazy things in the background. I've seen, you know, I shouldn't see your linen closet behind you, so I can, you know, be picking if your towels are rolled or folded. Like, remove those distractions from me. Your fan over your head going and making you turn into a helicopter. Remove those distractions. And what it comes down to is you can't see these things objectively the first time that you're sitting down for your interview. You need to be able to do a mock interview, record yourself, walk away, and come back and then look at it from a clear lens, really to catch up on these things. Audio, is your computer audio from your laptop picking up your phone tapping on the side of your desk? Is there a weird muffling noise because your audio is actually picking up next to or underneath your computer? Little things like that. Or is your pet around and you can hear them? The final frame. So the interview, especially if it's pre-recorded, goes from the entire time. So if your final frame is you looking down and searching for the off button, be aware of that. So keep that professional face and that professional view all the way from start to finish. And then again, reading the virtual room. So it's important that you try as hard as you can to read body language virtually. That's much harder virtually. But if you notice that an individual is a little bit more distracted when you're talking, picking up on those cues. But at the end of the day, more is less. You're probably all checking out a little bit at this point. And it's not because Ms. Stacy and I are absolutely thrilling, but it's because our attention span is cut in half virtually. So it definitely, absolutely in asynchronous interviews or any virtual format, I would say more is less, be even more concise, because the individual is not going to have as much of an attention span as if you were there in a conversation two-way in person.
Mhm. So continuing sort of our last hangups for an in-person interview, reminder that first impressions start long before you enter the interview room or hop on the Zoom. It's from the very first interaction you have with that employer, from the time they send you a confirmation that your application was submitted. That is the beginning of your first impression. When you submit that application all the way up to the interview process. So please keep in mind, again, going back to that digital image that you have of yourself. Ashley made a good point earlier when we were talking about these hangups. When you're on the way driving to an in-person interview, be careful how you drive on the road, because you could very well have some road rage against someone that will end up on your interview panel. It is a small world, you guys, so pay attention to those types of things and be very on from beginning to end in this process. Make sure you're ditching the devices, no matter if you're on a Zoom interview, don't have your eyes over here to the side. Again, point out the elephant in the room. If you're taking notes, just make sure they know exactly what you're doing. Don't constantly check your smartwatch for updates. That's incredibly rude. Put that thing on theater mode and go on into your interview. Pay attention to your body language. Just like Ashley said, for a pre-recorded or a Zoom interview, angles matter. And if you're constantly shifting around, if that's from nerves, you've got to find something to be able to ground yourself. If that's holding a pen in your hand, make sure that's not clicking it back and forth. But if you need to hold something, if you fidget a lot, find what works for you. I am one of those people that I feel like I constantly have to have something in my hand. So whether that is my notebook that I'm taking or making sure it's something that I'm actually going to be productive with. If it is a pen, I want to make sure I'm actually writing down notes as they speak to me. Again, that speaks to my level of engagement and how interested I am in learning what they have to say, just as much as they're interested in learning what I have to say, so they can decide whether I'm a good fit for this position. Reading the room. Who's in the room? An interview with a group of your peers, or maybe those who you'll actually be working with on a day-to-day basis, might look a little bit different from speaking with leadership on one of your final rounds of interviews. So making sure you're reading the room, not that you should be any more or less professional given who's in there. You should treat everyone equally in that respect, but it's just paying attention to what the energy is, like Miss Ashley was saying, how they interact with one another, and you following suit and just being your professional best the entire time. Don't waste your wait for anything in the interview. Again, this is that exclusive opportunity where you've made it to this round. If you have questions, ask them. If you have these incredible things that you want to say, maybe they didn't ask a question about it, find that way to weave it into the interview, especially if it's something you want them to learn about you that they haven't been able to up to this point in the process. They don't know everything that they have to learn about you, and it may not always fit within the confines of their question list for you. And so make sure, if you have something to add about yourself, you can say, something that I really do believe would be a valuable addition to this interview. I know it wasn't an explicit question that was asked of me, but it is something I want to relay to the panel today, is this, making sure that they know what you want them to learn. Paying attention to the culture and the environment. Again, this is your chance to learn about them in a way that you won't outside of this process. And so it aids to finding out whether this really is going to be a place that you want to show up to every single day. Whether it's a remote opportunity or an in-person, you have to figure out what the culture is and how excited and what your motivation level is going to be to get out of bed every morning to do it. You are, your life should not be entirely revolved around your job, but there should be a very realistic recognition that you're there for a large majority of your day. It's a big chunk of your day to not enjoy actually being where you are and doing what you're doing. So pay attention to that. And sort of a final note is not letting your guard down in this interview, and that lends back to reading that room and paying attention to, just because you have a lot in common with an interviewer, you know, things are getting along so well, you're laughing, you're having a great time. The interview does not end if they take you out to lunch that day. If further email communication after, do not text them in an email. Don't use communication that you would with your friends or family members, and don't overshare. There is such a thing. Just because you're going to lunch, that interview is not over. So don't let your professional guard down. Keep that very up and keep that etiquette present at all times. It's so, so important.
So part of that preparation we said earlier not only goes into preparing what to ask or how to perform in the interview, but also preparing sample questions that you want to ask. So I call these my non-negotiables. The non-negotiables that I need to learn about that company or about the role before I leave the room. And sometimes that's things about the role, the position, the day-to-day, the expectations. And so there are a list a mile long online about sample follow-up questions, and you see some on your screen here, but I would say it's okay to use one or two of these, but I would try to prepare some that are specific to the role. So if you have a specific question, like if you want to know, okay, I saw that many of your members are a part of XYZ organization, asking about opportunities to get engaged in professional organizations. So taking what is normally a general question of how can I add professional development opportunities to my role, make it more specific to the role based on what you've learned in the interview or what you've learned in your own research. So it's okay to use these sample questions as a template, but I would personalize them to the role and to what you know about the position or want to know about the position. So I always go into an interview with a list of questions. So what do I need to walk out knowing about this role? And then at the end, I have a set of questions, again, that I don't want to forget to ask. So what is the next steps of the process? If you have a really good interview and it's fantastic, you're immediately going to call a friend and rave about how well you did. And the very first question out of their mouth is going to be, great, when do you hear back? And you're going to go, I don't know. So you will forget because you will get excited. So write it down, remind yourself. So that way, when you're wrapping up and you're leaving and they say, if you have any more questions, you can look down and make sure that everything has been answered. And then that would be an opportunity. And then the other question that I wouldn't leave the room until I knew is, you know, I learned so much today that I'm sure I'll have follow-up questions. If I do, is there a specific point of contact that I should reach out to? So that's a really great follow-up question as well. Your only questions when asked, do you have any other questions for us? Should not be those two. You should have others that are specific to the role, but those are two that, again, a lot of these may be answered in the interview or the interviewer may bring up on their own. That's okay. Don't re-ask it. But just make sure that it is answered at some point in some way during the interview.
Mm-hmm. After the interview, thank you is so important. Again, you need to make sure you're doing it as soon as possible, whatever format your interview was, whether it's written, verbal, however you want to say it, make sure it is said to the people that invited you to be a part of this part of the process, making sure you're thanking them for their time, learning a little bit more about you, and you being able to have that opportunity to learn more about them was so important and such a special opportunity. So please make sure you say thank you and send that note. Specifically probably within that 24-hour time period. Don't let so much delay go by that then they forget, like, oh wow, that interview was a long time ago. That's a little weird. And so then be mindful of your follow-up outreach. We know you're excited. We know you can't wait to hear back, but there are so many other things going on their side of the fence that you don't know that takes place on an HR side of things. There's a lot of tape to have to cut through in any type of hiring process. So be patient with them because they'll appreciate it and they are getting back to you as quickly as possible. They are not sitting on the other side knowing that they can contact you the next day, but just aren't. They are having to follow a lot of different protocols. And so be mindful of that. If you feel like you're way too biased about your outreach period and you want to phone a friend, call your career consultant and say, hey, it's been this long, Ms. Herman, should I reach out at this point? What should my process be? Because it's going to be very specific to the situation at hand. And I think in the meantime, while you're waiting, during that process, don't waste your wait. Don't sit by the phone and wait for this offer, because you have so many other things going on, especially as a student, especially in whatever roles that you have. Just continue working towards your goals, because that will make the answer come a lot quicker. And so just continue working towards, if you have other opportunities that you're applying for at the same time, if you've got schoolwork to work on, organizations, clubs, focus on all the different things that you were doing before you applied to this, because they're just as important now as they were before you started the interview process. And then finally, you just have to let it go, because after the interview, there's nothing else that can be done. Both, it's in a good way. It's not in a negative connotation. It's just to say that you're done. It should be a time of celebration, that it was a learning period for you, no matter how it went. Whether you don't feel like it was your best interview ever, you learned something from the process about that company, about yourself, about maybe doing additional practice in the future. You've learned something, and that's valuable, and that's a takeaway. And so letting it go, if no one can recognize this crazy creature at the bottom, it is obviously our bear with Elsa's head on top. And I just can't bring myself to part with this image. People laugh at it or fear it every single time, but it's on here, and it's essentially just that reminder to, after the interview, you have to let it go and you have to move on, because you've got goals to reach and they are not going to wait for you just sitting around for them. So you've got to keep after what you're doing in the meantime.
I want to add to the thank you. I talked to a student yesterday and I asked if she had been following up after the interviews, and she said, well, oh yeah, about a week after I send a message and thank them. That's too late, you guys. People are making decisions almost sometimes immediately after the interview. I would say within 12 to 24 hours maximum is when you need to do the follow-up. I am a sucker for written thank you cards. Emails are great, but I love opening up an envelope. So my rule of thumb is, when I go into an interview, the back of my Padfolio always has thank you cards in it with stamps. So I do not let myself get out of the car without dropping in the mailbox those thank you cards. Otherwise, I will be 2 weeks later and realize I haven't sent it yet. So do whatever you need to do to set yourself up for success in the future, but a week later is too late. So we mentioned earlier that practice makes better progress, not necessarily perfect. You as a Mercer student, whether you be alumni or current student, have access to this incredible tool. You guys, this works exactly like HireVue, which is the most often used asynchronous interview platform. And it has a massive question library with sample questions that are specific to industry. If you're looking for interviews going into grad school versus full-time job, career changer versus internship. So great resources here. There are ways for you. There are sample questions, there are sample answers, there are little tips and tricks on what they're looking for in those answers. So if you do nothing, I would say look through the sample library. But in addition to that sample library, there is the option for you to pre-record yourself and do mock interviews with yourself, so you can review and self-review. But then in the platform, there's a really great way where you can actually forward that video to someone else who may not have access to the big interview platform, but they can watch the video. So if you have a trusted friend or mentor, or Miss Stacy or I, and you do some of these questions and want to send it to us, then that person can evaluate and give you that immediate feedback. This is such an incredible resource. I cannot tell you how many students have come up to me and said, oh my gosh, Ms. Herman, it is the same exact thing as the platform I just did. I'm so glad I got my test run out first with you.
Mm-hmm. I know Miss Ashley and I have been speaking for quite a while now, giving these incredible tips. And so for those of you that may have taken, whether it's a quick nap, doing some homework on the side, I need everyone to bring their attention back specifically to this slide and now the next one, because this is arguably the most important part of this presentation today. A part of this clinic is, again, no matter how many tips we've given you today, there is a resource to help you practice it. And whether that's the platform of Big Interview and practicing those online, recording yourself, I would say a huge part of it is going to be scheduling with your career consultant. Schedule that appointment and say, Hey, Miss Ashley, hey, Miss Stacy, hey, whoever it is. I don't even have an interview coming up right now, but I would really love to just get in some general practice because I've never had one before. I've especially never had a phone one, and I'm just so nervous about the prospect of that because I know that's usually the first round of things. They call you on the phone and I can't see anyone's face, and that makes me really nervous. Schedule the appointment. If you want to schedule an appointment to talk about how we handle mock interviews in our office, I have that all the time. Sort of, I call it my preliminary call about mock interviews. I tell them everything that we're going to be doing in their mock interview and their style of choice, whatever format you want to do, we cater to that. And then obviously getting into a more specific situation is, hey, Stacy, I have an interview coming up next week and I need some practice for it. We are going to practice in the format that it's going to be given to you in. We're going to talk about the questions that make you feel most hesitant, and we are going to do everything that needs to be done to make sure you walk out of the office or you end the Zoom call feeling more confident than when you came. Because that is the point of it, guys. We are here because we want so badly for you to feel like you can present yourselves with confidence. You have so many incredible things to say, and the last thing I would want is anyone to feel like they couldn't articulate themselves in an interview because you have all the things to say, you just didn't know how to say it, and you didn't know how to express it to that employer, whether that was for nerves, whether it was because you just couldn't flesh out the situation the way you wanted to. That is why we exist. That's why we're here. While we have a vast menu of services, this is personally one of my favorite things that we offer you guys. I love, love, love doing mock interviews. And so just know that we are always happy to do it. This is not a chore for us. We love hearing about the outcome. We hope you keep us posted on the process if you're going through an interview right now. We love getting those emails or those phone calls. Sometimes students even schedule an appointment just to say, hey, Stacey, I got it. I landed in the internship, or I got the full-time position. And I mean, we file those away, guys. We save them, and we're just like, oh, that was so awesome to get to help them through their process. I love, 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 love hearing about your positive career outcome after that. And so speaking of that, so please go on Handshake, schedule that appointment, whether it's just to get general practice or whether you've got something coming up, because this is definitely the season for it. And again, just know that we serve you for life. And so you don't lose access to us or this incredible resource after you graduate. We're still here and we're still absolutely ready to help.